Well, welcome everyone to the final lecture in our close reading series, Surveying Structure. In this lecture, I want to talk about structure as something that affects our experience with a poem. So there are a few main types of structure that we'll be looking at today. The first is visual structure, how a poem is organized on the page. The second is audible structure, the way it's organized according to sound. Thirdly, we're going to be talking a little bit about emotional structure, how sometimes the form itself moves with the emotional transits of a poem. And then finally, we'll be looking at line endings, specifically enjambment. And that's when a line of poetry ends without any punctuation at the end of the line, and you're just left with that blank space. We're going to be talking about what that does. So we'll be thinking about how structure affects our experience with the poem. Now, most poetry today is written and meant to be heard as well as seen. We see that once poetry moves from its specifically oral context into a written form, that it now becomes partially a visual art. And we can say that our first encounter with a poem before we even read it is the way it greets us on the page, the way the black ink is sitting there organized among the white space. Some forms are immediately recognizable. A sonnet, you can usually tell, is just a 14-line chunk. It's very identifiable. You might also think about the shape poems that were popular in the 16th and 17th centuries. And we'll be looking at those here. One of the great masters of shape poetry is George Herbert. And I want to look at Easter Wings. Look at this. This is the way it was printed in 1633. You actually had to turn the book to read it. I'm not sure if that's how Herbert wanted them printed. They were printed after his death. However, here they are on the page. Now I want to talk about how this is not just a shape poem. It's just not a cutesy way of organizing verse, but it actually contributes to the experience and meaning of the poem. So let's look at Easter Wings in a normal block of text here. Now notice as you're reading, you descend into narrower lines. He begins, Lord, who createdst man in wealth and store, though foolishly he lost the same, decaying more and more, till he became most poor. Now what is happening here? The lines themselves are enacting that decay, becoming poor. We notice that here we have a trochee, Lord, who createdst, Lord, who createst man in wealth and store. Iambic predominantly, save for this trochee here at the beginning, and it's pentameter, since we have 5 of these iambs. Now, what do you do when you count the next line? Though foolishly he lost the same. Though foolishly he lost the same. That's 4 iambs. Tetrameter. Here we have decaying more and more, trimeter, till he became, that's dimeter, till he became most poor, then finally manometer. So since we've just learned about marking meter, we can see how the meter itself is playing into the line structure here. As he's describing the estate of man being lost till he became more poor, most poor, and then there's this hinge there. There's this thematic turning as the lines begin to grow again. With thee, O let me rise as larks, harmoniously, and sing this day thy victories. Then shall the fall further the flight in me. And you have that repetition of the F sound here that's contributing to this feathery sound of a bird's wings in flight. But what do you notice? It goes from manometer again, and then dimeter, trimeter, tetrameter, finally pentameter again. Now, let's look at the second stanza. My tender age. So, okay, first stanza had to deal with the general fall of Adam, of humanity. Here the poet applies it to himself. It's a personal application, and it enacts the same movement. My tender age in sorrow did begin, and still with sicknesses and shame. Thou didst so punish sin, that I became most thin. And you notice here, the lines become most thin. And yet here again is the turn, the prayer, the supplication. With thee let me combine, and feel thy victory. For, if I imp my wing on thine, affliction shall advance the flight in me. Notice the same thing is going on with flight, with this F. And we also have the V doing that as well, and the flight, the feathery sound of a bird's wing. What does this word imp mean? Well, it comes from the tradition of keeping falcons during this time. The wealthy landowners sometimes owned falcons, and when the falcon would damage its wing, they would graft on false feathers onto the wing so that they could fly. And this was called imping. So it's also a term used in agriculture for grafting. So Herbert is saying, if I imp my wing on thy divine wing, then affliction, which made him most thin, shall surprisingly advance the flight in me. So that's one way that structure here is working to inform the sense. And now let's look at Edmund Spenser's Canto 1, Stanza 1 of Book 1 of the Faerie Queene. I want to talk about visual structure and sound structure. Spenser invented this stanza. It's called the Spenserian stanza, and he uses it in his great narrative poem, The Faerie Queene. And I just want to read this very first stanza of the first canto. A gentle knight was pricking on the plain, y-clad in mighty arms and silver shield, wherein old dints of deep wounds did remain, the cruel marks of many a bloody field. Yet arms till that time did he never wield. His angry steed did chide his foaming bit, as much disdaining to the curb to yield. Full jolly knight he seemed, and fair did sit, as one for knightly jousts and fierce encounters fit. What do we notice about the structure? Well, if you have a page open of the Faerie Queene, you have the book, you'll see that the page is organized in these little digestible chunks. And so what happens when, during the proliferation of print culture, is you get a private reading public. Prior to the Renaissance, prior to the Reformation, most poetry was enjoyed audibly. It was read or chanted in church in the form of psalms, or it was sung at festivals in the form of ballads, perhaps. But as people began to read more, poetry then begins to take this shape, and so Spenser makes up these stanzas. We're going to be talking about the form here. They're so readable, and they just carry you along through the story, these little bite-sized stanzas. We see that this is iambic pentameter. We can hear it. A gentle knight was pricking on the plain. We have 8 lines of iambic pentameter. 1, 2, 3, 7, 8. And then what do we have here? It's still iambic, but as one for knightly jousts and fierce encounters fit. There's an extra foot there. There are 6 iambs, so this is iambic hexameter. It's a beautiful little form, remarkably suited for Spenser's storytelling style. As you go on through the book, you find that the stanza is really perfect for the kinds of luxurious digressions that Spenser indulges in. He can use it for vivid description, but it also is used for quick action, for fighting scenes, and fast movement and transitions from one subject to another. It can at times be both enchanting and analytical, very emotional and moving. At other times, it can be mystical and very logical. So let's get a sense of the structures here. So we have the visual structure there with the lines. Now I want to look at the sound structures. What about the rhyme scheme? So we have plain, that's rhyme A, then shield, that'll be rhyme B. Remain, okay, that's an A rhyme. Field, that's a B rhyme. Wield, that's another B rhyme, so we have a couplet here, a couplet tie. Bit, that's a new sound, so we'll call that C. Yield, that is also a B rhyme. Sit, that's C. Fit, that's C. Another couplet. And what do you notice? Well, for one, the first 5 lines right here are tied off with a couplet, giving it a sense of conclusion. And what's being concluded? The description of the knight. Momentarily, we're getting a description of him riding across the plain. This horse, clad or dressed in mighty armor and a silver shield. Old dints are within this armor from battle, from the bloody field. Yet arms at that time did he never wield. This is perhaps someone else's armor. And then there's a turn. His angry steed. So do you notice how this rhyme here is giving this these 5 lines a sense of closure? His angry steed did chide his foaming bit, as much disdaining to the curb to yield. His horse is a little undisciplined, which is foreshadowing a bit about the Red Cross Knight's own character. And then finally, closing off the stanza is this couplet here at the end, another couplet. And the stanza thematically returns back to the knight. Full jolly knight he seemed, and fair did sit, as one for knightly jousts and fierce encounters fit. A nice conclusion there. You notice that extra foot, the hexameter at the end of all the Spenserian stanzas, give it a sense of finality and oftentimes a weight or significance. And so that the sound of that foot and the way it looks visually in the stanzas signal a conclusiveness, a coming to the end of a period, which is exactly what's happening here. So this is an idea of how both visual and audible structures within poetry can inform the meaning and can carry us along through experience. Now, following the Renaissance and the Reformation, there was this flowering of lyrical experimentation. And one of the most successful experiments of this kind can be found in Sir Philip Sidney and the Countess of Pembroke's Book of Psalms. And here is a psalm that Mary Sidney wrote, translated from the Hebrew Psalms. And it's one of these lyrical experimentations. She's actually a wonderful inventor of lyrical forms. And George Herbert is certainly indebted to Mary Sidney here. Then say I, oh, might I but cut the wind, borne on the wing the fearful dove doth bear. Stay would I not, till I in rest might stay. Far hence, oh, far, then would I take my way unto the desert, and repose me there. These storms of woe, these tempests left behind. Let's keep our attention here at this stanza. How does the poem greet you on the page? It's almost like waves, you could say. It's almost also like the aerial view of a dove flying, perhaps suggesting the flight of the dove here in this line. Fearful dove doth bear. You notice the repetition of not only the D here, but also the O sound. Dove and doth bear. What other sounds? We have wind, so this is an A rhyme. Bear, that's B. Stay is C. Way is C. There is B. Behind is A. So instead of in the Spenserian stanza, where we saw the lines coming to a conclusive or a transitional couplet, we have the couplet right in the middle of this 6-line stanza. Here, this couplet gives us a sense of transition. There's a period at the end of stay. Stay would I not, till I in rest might stay. Notice how this line begins and ends with the same word. That's called a panalepsis. I and I, there's another one here, so it's almost like a literal hinge, a geometric inversion here with the repetition of those two words. A small chiasmus, perhaps. Far hence, oh, far then would I take my way. But what's going on with the sounds? What are the sounds calling back to? Well, when you come to this line, this half of the stanza calls back to the first half of the stanza. Stay rhymes with way. Two opposite ideas, really, because the dove is on her way, and she will not rest, she will not stay, but she will take her way unto the desert. So we have this sound here, we have there and bear. But when we come to the end of the stanza, these storms of woe, these tempests left behind, rhymes with wind. And these would have been nearer to a rhyme in the original pronunciation here. What's the significance of having behind call back sonically to the word wind? Well, partly it's echoing back to her wish to bear her wings on the wind and leave the tempests behind. So it's almost looking back both in an echo and in the sense of what she wishes to leave behind by traveling on the wind. Mary Sidney Herbert was an excellent lyricist, and I think her psalms are actually better than Sir Philip Sidney's. It's likely that she knew Hebrew and had a Hebrew tutor, so she could have actually been working with the original Hebrew psalms, whereas both of them primarily relied on translations in Italian, French, even Greek, and other English translations to create these lyrical experiments. Okay, that's my plug for Mary Sidney Herbert. Let's now move on to the idea of emotional structures. There are all kinds of emotional structures. You can even say there are kinds of logical structures. If you remember in the first lecture on placing in context, we read Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, and you saw how that was organized by logical structures. There are 3 main verse paragraphs, all enforcing a logical persuasion, a logical turn. Now, some poems rely upon the turn of emotions. Elegies, for instance, often attempt to lead the reader and the speaker from grief to a consolation. It often wants to cast a new and dignified and noble light on its subject through the course of the poem, and in a way that intensifies the sense of loss of the subject. An elegy, by the way, is a short lyric poem written in commemoration of a departed loved one usually, and it usually has a dignified ceremonial tone to it. And Samuel Johnson's On the Death of Dr. Robert Levitt is a good example of this. It's got this slow, dignified Horatian style that is in the style of Horace, the Latin poet. Now, before we survey the structure, let me just place this in context. Dr. Samuel Johnson was a literary critic in the 18th century, very generous man. He's known primarily for his Lives of the English Poets, series of biographical essays, critical treatments of the poet's works. He also wrote the Dictionary of the English Language. He's an enormous mind, a huge scholar, and a great stylist. In London, he himself was not very rich, and one of his poor housemates was this Dr. Robert Levitt. He was a poor, unknown lay physician who ministered to the poor people in London, and he would charge very small fees. Sometimes, if the person could not pay, they would sometimes pay in drink, and they would give the doctor a bottle of liquor. And because of this, Dr. Levitt would sometimes end up drunk. And Johnson said that Dr. Levitt was perhaps the only man he ever knew to get intoxicated out of motives of prudence. It was a great friendship they shared, and eventually Robert Levitt died, and Samuel Johnson wrote this very moving elegy for him. It begins, "Condemned to hope's delusive mine, as we toil from day to day, by sudden blasts or slow decline, our social comforts drop away." And we'll stop here and notice that Johnson, the poet, is laying out a general principle about the condition of humanity. Condemned to hope's delusive mine. And as we hasten to the grave, slowly our comforts decline. Well tried through many a varying year, see Levitt to the grave descend, officious, innocent, sincere, of every friendless name the friend. Notice here in stanza 2 that the general is now applied to the particular, to Levitt. Yet still he fills affection's eye, obscurely wise and coarsely kind, nor lettered arrogance deny thy praise to merit unrefined. Stanza 4, when fainting nature called for aid, and hovering death prepared the blow, his vigorous remedy displayed the power of art without the show. Here, when fainting nature or a failing body, talking about someone sick, perhaps the poor that he ministered to, and death was hovering by for one of his patients, he vigorously displayed the remedy with all skill and no show. The power of art without the show, meaning he wasn't doing it to be seen. He was doing it skillfully to save the life. In misery's darkest caverns known, his useful care was ever nigh. Where hopeless anguish poured his groan, and lonely want retired to die. Notice that trope of personification. We saw it with affection, personified as one with an eye. He goes to misery's darkest caverns, and where hopeless anguish was groaning, there he went. No summons mocked by chill delay, no petty gain disdained by pride. Let me just pause there and explain. Sometimes when a doctor was called on by a sick patient, he had to run to the doctor's house, he had to call the doctor, and he would make the trip across the city. Sometimes the doctors would delay to show the patient how important he was. But not Levitt. When he was summoned, he did not mock it with chill delay, no petty gain disdained by pride. The modest wants of every day, the toil of every day supplied. He only made as much money that was sufficient for each day. And notice this, his virtues walked their narrow round, nor made a pause, nor left a void. And sure the eternal master found the single talent well employed. Now something about this poem that you've probably picked up on is the very solemn and steady pace of the meter. It's all iambic. His virtues walked their narrow rounds. See those 4 iambs? It's all iambic tetrameter. Nor made a pause, but that ceremonious, relentless, steady pace is enacted by the ceremonious, undeviated meter. Sure, the eternal maker, that's God, found the single talent well employed. This, of course, is a reference to the parable of the talents, a very favorite parable of Johnson. Levitt was not a man of many means. He was not a man of many talents. He had one talent, but he employed it well. The busy day, the peaceful night, unfelt, uncounted, glided by. His frame was firm, his powers were bright, though now his 80th year was nigh. And here comes the moment of death. Then with no throbbing fiery pain, no cold gradations of decay, death broke at once the vital chain, and freed his soul the nearest way. It was an instant death, no gradual decay. Now notice that this poem does not soar in hyperbole or exaggeration. It's very honest, it's very sincere, and its unwavering iambic tetrameter is steady in its pace like Levitt's virtues walking their round. But do you notice how the poem began in Hope's delusive minds? It began in this place of ceaseless toil and gradually reveals Levitt to be a hero amid this condition. And at the end, we have this turn where suddenly he's broken free. And so you see how the elegy has taken us from one place where it found us, all of humanity, including Levitt, within this delusive mind, and then presents Levitt as a hero who then achieves liberation through this very dignified death. Death broke at once the vital chain and freed his soul the nearest way. Now, we should talk about enjambment, which is not something that I've mentioned in the other lectures. Enjambment, as I explained at the beginning of this video, is what happens when a line ends at the end without any punctuation. I'll show you how Milton uses this. He was a master of enjambment. And what the effect it has upon us as we're reading visually on the page, and we come to that end where the sense overflows into the next line. Here's how Milton does it. In this passage from Paradise Lost, the portress of hell is describing the fall of Satan. Meanwhile war arose, and fields were fought in heaven, wherein remained, for what could else, to our almighty foe, clear victory, to our part loss and rout through all the Empyrean. Down they fell. Notice how the fell is left on the end there without any punctuation. Down they fell, and our eyes have to fall to the next line. Driven headlong. Notice the rhythm here. Driven, headlong, 2 trochees. The meter is headlong in itself. It's got that motion where it's pushing from the front. Down they fell. We go to the next line, overflowing. Driven headlong from the pitch of heaven. Down, again left on the end here without any punctuation, so we have to go to the next. And as we're in motion, down to where? Into this deep. this phrase collides with the sense, and in the general fall, again, enjambment here, no punctuation, down to the next line. And in the general fall, I also. At which time this powerful key into my hand was given, the charge to keep these gates forever shut, which none can pass without my opening. This is a fun example of one instance of enjambment in Milton. He'll use it to different effects elsewhere throughout the poem, but this is one of the fun examples. Now, I want to talk about, just to highlight the power of enjambment upon our consciousness as we're reading. I want to turn to a famous passage in William Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. The full title you'll see, lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey, on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour, July 13, 1798. This is a poem that you really need to read the whole of. I'm very conflicted by presenting just this piece of it, this very beautiful piece of it, but it really needs to be seen on whole. The whole poem has its own motion. It starts in the outward world, and then the poet turns inward, and then turns outward to his sister. And so it has this emotional, thematic movement. The entire poem is a good example of the kinds of structures, emotionally, thematically, audibly, visually, even the way the first paragraphs are separated, on how structure works. But we're just going to look at this brief section here. I just want to bring your attention to this passage that picks up abundant recompense, completing the sense of the previous line. Here we begin. For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth. Notice the rhythm. For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour, it's perfect iambic pentameter, unrhymed, it's called blank verse, of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes. It has a nice easy pace, and he's hearing oftentimes what? The still sad music of humanity. The emphasis there on the of. But do you see what happens here? The iambic rhythm is disrupted here at still sad music. These are 3 consecutive stressed syllables. Why did Wordsworth do that? Did he make a mistake? Certainly not. It's the art of great poets to vary their rhythm, and the effect here to have this cluster of stressed syllables is to draw our attention to important words and ideas. The still sad music, connected not only by the stress, but also with that S sound in each word. And why do that? That was part of the experience, because the still sad music is disrupting the regular music of the lines. Nor harsh, nor grating, though of ample power, we're settling back into iambic rhythm, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. Now listen to the meter as he continues. What he's describing here is this power in nature, this spirit in nature that's impelling all things. It is the great unity, it's the one life in all external nature. He's describing a conversion from a purely sensational and materialistic love of nature, of its forms and of its dizzy raptures, he says, to a more sober love of the ideal forms that the forms of nature contain within them. He's describing almost a spiritual experience of seeing into the life of things. He says, and I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused. Regular iambic rhythm there. Whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man. You notice here where he's describing all of the motion. The round ocean and the living air and the blue sky. The meter is rough in a way. It's conversational, but it's ruffled, it's disturbed, it's not settled. And then as it comes here to this, and in the mind of man. it settles back into iambic rhythm. Whereas here it was disturbed of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air. It departs from that regularity and then settles back into it here. It's a favorite trick of Wordsworth's. And in the mind of man. There's a beautiful thing about that phrase, and in the mind of man. Notice how that word in is audibly and literally contained within the word mind. And then we have mind with the M being linked in alliteration and consonance with man. And so the whole thing is linked together with sound. Okay, I told you we were going to be looking at enjambment. We've been doing all kinds of close reading here, but now let me bring you to enjambment. So Wordsworth has us settle there briefly. He touches down in perfect iambs, and in the mind of man. And then he takes flight again, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things, speaking about this spiritual energy behind nature. Therefore am I still a lover of the meadows and the woods and mountains. Logical word that, therefore, but look, what does this enjambment do? If I weren't going through this with you and you were reading this for the first time, what would happen in your mind is when you come to this still at the end of this line without any punctuation, you would probably think stillness. After all this motion, a motion and a spirit that's impelling all thought, all thinking things, and rolling through all things, this stillness comes as a contrast to all that motion. We think, therefore am I still, as in the lack of motion. And yet Wordsworth means it in terms of continuity. So what happens? Therefore am I still. Our minds, we don't know what's at the beginning of the next line, but as our minds, as we're in transit to the next line, our mind has to hold on to that idea of stillness, and then in a way, give it up as it's corrected. Therefore am I still a lover. Therefore do I remain a lover. So it's not necessarily a literal stillness. But what happens in your mind is as you're reading it, the mind never gives up, really, the initial thought, but entertains both. The correction is not so much a trade, but an addition to. Because there is a certain stillness, a tranquility in this continuity. Therefore am I still a lover of the meadows and the woods and mountains. So sometimes Wordsworth will do that. He'll place a word at the end of the line without any punctuation. In your mind, it's almost like walking down the stairs in the dark. There's that one moment where your foot hasn't quite reached the next bottom step, but you know it's there. And in transit, you're stepping out in faith to the next step. Well, just so with poetry. You're walking down the lines. Your eyes are moving. And as the lines go on, we have this hesitation, which is constantly assured by the next line, and corrected, and amended, and added to, and fulfilled. If you're watching this in the course on the website, in the link below, there's also some additional commentary about enjambment from scholars that I hope you'll check out as well. So these are some various ways to think about structure in poetry. Before you even move on to identifying proper forms like odes and sonnets, this is something good to keep in mind, because you can know all the fancy terms about kinds of poems, but if you aren't experiencing it, if you aren't allowing it to work upon your mind as you're reading it and surrendering your imagination to it, then it's all for nothing. So thanks everyone for joining me in this series, and until next time.